I'm Barb Stein, and I represent Trail of Johnson County, and we're one of the organizations sponsoring Jean's talk today. But the League of Women Voters and the Iowa City Public Library are also sponsors, and that tells you a lot when three organizations think an event is an important enough event to sponsor it together. Our event today is being live streamed so people can watch from home, and it is also being recorded. So you will be able to find it again, and you might want to because there's so much information, you may want to see it again after you've heard it the first time. It will be available both on the League's page and on the library page. So the library just said anytime you can't find something that's live streamed, just call them up and they will help you. My pleasure is getting to introduce my friend, Jean Donham today, Dr. Jean Donham, and her title is Public Education for the Public Good. And it's a timely conversation to hear about, I think, and a great tie to the past and how we got where we are today and that kind of thing. So I know that you're going to come away with many things to think about. I've known Jean very many years now, almost 50. And I guess looking back, over the last few days, I've been thinking, what would we really say about Jean? And say, she is a consummate educator and has been from the very beginning, from the first time I ever met her. At that time, she was our first librarian with a real library in an elementary school in Iowa City. We'd had 2 shelves for our library before, and her job was to make a collection, to meet with our children and teach our children, and to teach us as a staff, and to interact with our parents too. So educating all the way with a whole school community. She went on to become the director of all of our librarians and was certainly a mentor to all of us through our whole careers in practices, good practices in libraries. And she was also writing books. And some of her books are still purchased all the time as kind of the Bibles of how to run a library and what the issues are. She went on to teach college. She's been a professor at University of Iowa Library School, at Wartburg, at Cornell. And Cornell, of course, has a public library and a college library together in the same site. So she has those administrative skills, but always educating the public and her constituents and students and other teachers and other librarians. And one of her key issues has always been how important it is to learn the facts, both sides, to promote inquiry as the way to be a good citizen and an informed person. So you can see why the fit is perfect today. Please welcome Jean, and look forward to hearing you speak. Public education for the public good.
Thank you, Barb. I appreciate that very much. Hello. Thank you for coming today. As we begin today, I want to clarify what I mean by the public good. I see the public good as those things in our culture that benefit not only the individual, but also the society, a good to which all members of the society have access and from which no one can be easily excluded. So think roads, think libraries, think police and fire departments, and I believe, think public schools. While it would seem that people would automatically seek to maintain those institutions that serve the public good, in fact, in a pluralistic society such as ours, different people have different ideas about what social systems constitute a public good and what systems we will all agree to support. This reflects, perhaps, an internal conflict we have in this country between American individualism and the common or public good. I might add that valuing the public good requires that we trust those institutions founded to advance that public good. So on to schools. For centuries, we had a history of supporting public education. Our early founders recognized the importance of education, but the concept of free public education for all didn't really begin to take hold on a wider scale until the 1830s, the establishment of the common schools as a path toward social cohesion and a path out of poverty. Even then, there was resistance from those who didn't want to pay to educate other people's children. But gradually, more and more states endorsed the idea of universal public education, and that idea found its way into state constitutions. It was not until the latter part of the 19th century, though, that public elementary schools really became available to virtually all children in nearly all parts of the country. And then high school attendance became commonplace only in the 20th century, if we think about that. And then came Brown versus Board of Education, which expanded that notion of equal opportunity when it declared that separate but equal did not in fact constitute equality, and that separate but equal did not qualify as equal protection under the law, as prescribed in the 14th Amendment. And then later, the IDEA came along and set requirements for serving students with disabilities. And you can see the expanse of public education increasing and increasing and increasing over time. Throughout that time, throughout those years, people believed in public education. But it seems we hit a bit of a turning point in the 1980s with the publication of A Nation at Risk. A Nation at Risk was a report that was grounded on data on student performance on the SAT exam. In the early 1960s, college going was still relatively rare, and it was mostly top students, often largely well-off white males, frankly, who took standardized tests like the SAT and applied to college using those scores. Well, 20 years later, by the 1980s, college was becoming more available to more students and was being seen as more important to getting a good job. So more people were taking the SAT, for example, and applying for college. And this included many first-generation college goers, like me. When you lumped everyone's scores together, as A Nation at Risk did, what we saw was a declining average score from the 1960s to the 1980s. And this was portrayed then as a view that public education was failing, that we were a nation at risk. Interestingly, in 1990, a new report was issued called the Sandia Report, looking at the same data as A Nation at Risk. And in those data, they came to a very different conclusion about public education. Because in those data, they stratified the test takers by socioeconomic status, by racial and gender characteristics or subgroups. And when they did that, what they found was that within each of those groups, within the groups, scores were actually increasing slightly. So maybe the nation wasn't really at risk, but the genie was out of the bottle. Emphasis on accountability had come into vogue and resulted in a number of federal education initiatives, beginning with Goals 2000 under the Clinton administration, followed by No Child Left Behind in the Bush administration, Race to the Top and Every Student Succeeds in the Obama administrations. So we had all of these new federal mandates coming that were measuring schools largely based on test scores and creating environments that suggested that we're not so sure teachers are doing their jobs well, and we're not so sure that students are having the opportunity to learn that they should have. And so all of that began this sentiment of, are our schools doing their jobs well? And then came COVID. And parents, during the time of COVID, as you recall, became angry after schools were online for too long. Many parents resisted the requirements for masks and other safety protocols. And then we had this anti-vaccination movement coming along as well. And all of those made up what I would describe as a conflict between the public good and public health and the individual's wants and desires for freedoms. So this created then an environment very different from the environment we saw during the growth and development of public education. But let's go back to history for a moment. So Horace Mann was a leading force in developing public education. He became the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts in 1837, and in that role, he introduced the notion of the common school. He asserted some foundational principles for public education as a public good. He was reacting to the state of education in his day, when schooling was often religious or home-based or exclusive, or all three. If we reflect on those three attributes, religious, home-based, and exclusive, as we think about where we are today in our schools, it is a thought worth pondering. To paraphrase what Horace Mann was advocating, he called for schools to be paid for by the public, to embrace children of all religious, social, and ethnic backgrounds, to be free of all sectarian religious influence, to embrace the spirit, methods, and disciplines of a free society, and to be provided by well-trained professional teachers. Those are the schools that I believe we want for our children. In thinking about public education then as serving the public good, I think these are four ways in which public education does indeed serve the greater good as well as the individual's needs. Public education should provide, hopefully does provide, an understanding of civic life and democratic government. That is a societal need. We all need to understand democracy in order to participate in it. Cohesion and understanding among a variety of people that make up our citizenry. Clearly, the academic knowledge and preparation for careers, which is an individual benefit as well as a public good. And analytical and critical thinking skills that are essential to navigating today's information environment. Simply stated, serving the public good calls for us to think about our collective selves, not just our individual selves. Historically, historically, public schools, I think, have aimed for that notion of looking at both the individual need and the collective need. The public good assumes that we are interdependent. And in 1992, so back a ways, Newsweek columnist Robert Samuelson wrote, "We face a choice between a society where people accept modest sacrifices for a common goal or a more contentious society where groups selfishly protect their own benefits." Similarly, Lillian Katz from the University of Illinois aptly stated this. Lillian Katz just recently died, which breaks my heart. She was a wonderful educator. "We must recognize that the well-being of our own children is intimately linked to the well-being of all other people's children. After all, when one of our children needs life-saving surgery, someone else's child will perform it. When one of our children is harmed by violence, someone else's child will have committed it. The good life for our own children can be secured only if it is secured for all other people's children." And that is that notion of public good. That is that notion that we are all interdependent in the end. I would submit also that public schools are one of the first places where children have an opportunity to interact with, to befriend, to agree or disagree with, and to understand people from backgrounds that are different from their own. Private education, on the other hand, can result in isolating students by bringing them together only with others like themselves. This, it seems to me, runs the risk of diminishing children's opportunities for interactions, for their opportunities to grow in understanding and appreciation of people who are different from themselves. They can become the exclusive schools that Horace Mann saw in his time, whether based on religious dimensions or other societal dimensions. So concomitant with the shift away from the public good comes an emphasis on individualism and competition, particularly as represented by standardized tests, the measure of performance under legislation like No Child Left Behind, where schools were constantly compared to other schools, as well as its subsequent federal legislation, whose very names indicate that same, the race to the top, and every student succeeds. The question of trust in public education has become increasingly prominent in political discourse as individuals seek individual values and goals in contrast to societal or common values and goals. And it is, again, that tension between the needs of the individual and the needs of the public or the society that are at work here, it seems. So I'd like to look today at some legislative efforts in Iowa that seem to me, in some ways, to threaten to displace public education's role in sustaining the value of public good in favor of meeting individualistic aims and values instead. We're going to look at some legislation that has passed through our legislature and some legislation that has not. I'm going to talk about legislative efforts that affect classrooms and legislation that affects school libraries. As you could tell from my background, school libraries matter to me. I will emphasize again that the very introduction of bills, even if they don't pass, sends a message to educators and to citizens about our attitudes toward our schools and our educators. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind as we look at these bills that I'm going to share with you. I have to mention that I saw a New Yorker cartoon recently, and the text at the bottom of it was, listen carefully, "Allow me to interrupt your expertise with my confidence." And somehow that rang true to me as I thought about some of the legislation we've seen this year. So I'm going to start with House File 802, which passed in 2022. This is legislation that prohibits the teaching of divisive concepts. The language of the bill is somewhat vague. So does the term divisive concepts include, for example, the notion of reparations? Is redlining a divisive concept? What about even segregation? Or Jim Crow laws? What about the Japanese internment? What about Indian boarding schools? Are those divisive concepts? Do these topics deserve discussion? Not necessarily advocacy, but discussion in our schools? I would suggest that perhaps they do. As you see here, the legislation is perhaps a response to a project called the 1619 Project that many of you probably are familiar with, a project written under the authority of the New York Times by an Iowan, no less. That project was a complementary curriculum to be used in social studies classrooms, not to replace existing curriculum, but to complement it, to provide background on particularly the history of African Americans in this country. There was a considerable pushback, and in some states in the nation, there was legislation that particularly called out the 1619 Project. That was not the case here in Iowa, but it was probably, to some extent, the legislation was inspired by that. So you can see here that it aims to limit what is taught in history so that the United States of America and the state of Iowa they did not want any concepts taught that would suggest that the United States of America and the state of Iowa are fundamentally or systemically racist or sexist. I love the provision that says that we will not teach anything wherein an individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of that individual's race or sex. So I should not feel anguish for the experiences that Japanese Americans had during the war. I'm sorry, I will always feel anguish for those people and many other people who have suffered at various times in our history. At any rate, those are the concepts that are not to be taught. So teachers now are then expected to look at these provisions and choose their content accordingly in Iowa. This is law. The vagueness and the overreach of some laws pose significant constitutional issues, I think. Further, the vagueness creates a level of unease for teachers so as to have a chilling effect on the content that they feel comfortable introducing into their classrooms. These gag orders, I would call them, represent a fear that we are indoctrinating students in our schools. But to my way of thinking, such restrictions threaten to destroy the climate of open inquiry that is required in a free and democratic educational institution. While state governments and school boards do set curriculum standards, the Supreme Court has opined that they should reflect democratic principles and retain space for dissent. In the words of Justice Brennan, schools must not cast a pall of orthodoxy over a classroom. These laws could easily be used to block educators from asking their students to play devil's advocate or engage in a formal debate or defend controversial viewpoints as a part of just a pedagogical exercise. Yet, learning to engage in civil discourse seems to me an important part of learning to be a member of a democratic society. In April of 22, just after this bill was passed, a group of students at Iowa's Johnston High School near Des Moines reported that there was a different atmosphere in the school after the state's gag order became law, that one teacher explaining the history of redlining felt compelled to deny in class that they were trying to make the students feel guilty. Another teacher there felt unable to explain the motivations behind the 3/5 compromise in the Constitution for fear of violating this law. According to a recent survey by the RAND Corporation, a quarter of teachers nationwide have been directed by a school administrator to limit discussion about political or social issues in their classroom. So that is 802. On to 496. Senate File 496 was the big kahuna of this year's legislative session. This was the omnibus education bill that was passed this year. And I'm going to begin with a provision in it that did not survive in the final version of the law. And then later we'll return to some provisions that did. But I want to mention this transparency effort. It may come back, for one thing, just saying. And another is that I think it's important to think about the message it sends to teachers. If this provision had remained in the bill, it would have been a difficult issue for teachers to deal with. It called for teachers to post the syllabus for their course in advance on the school's internet site. It called for them to list online all the instructional materials, videos, images, printed materials, text, everything that they were going to be using needed to be posted in advance. They needed to notify parents if they made any changes in that so that parents could go back and look at the updated list. And it required that students take the civics test that is used for by the U.S. Immigration Service. So those were a few of the things that were proposed in this legislation that in the end did not pass. What that would have meant for teachers is, first of all, a huge documentation burden to just keep all of those lists up to date. It would have eliminated, as I see it, the opportunities for serendipity. So my son's a teacher. It's not uncommon in his classroom for something to come up in the classroom. And what do? they Google it and see what else they can find out about it. It is unclear to me whether under that transparency legislation a teacher could do that, because you would be using resources that you hadn't put on the list. So that serendipitous opportunity seems to me to be going away. It also makes it difficult to adapt for individual student needs. So you have kids reading something, and you recognize that you have a student who's having difficulty with that reading, and you know something else you could substitute for that child. Can you do that without putting it on the website first? Probably you would not be able to make that adaptation without announcing it ahead of time. It seems to me it could reduce teachers to the point of using their textbook only. I don't know how many of you have watched a 15-year-old, 16-year-old read a textbook. I don't think they find them particularly engaging. And I think we could risk losing even more students in terms of their interest. And finally, the civics test. I don't have a problem with kids knowing everything that's on the civics test. In fact, I think they ought to know as much as an immigrant coming into this country. What concerned me about that provision in the legislation was that when we mandate a test, there is the temptation to teach to the test. But what is important about the civics test is understanding all of the history behind everything that is in the test, so that students come to understand not just the fact that our government has 3 branches, but why it would have 3 branches and where that idea would have come from. And I worry that if we focus on the test and not on the background that led to the kind of government we have today, that could be problematic. These provisions that are in this transparency bill are generally referred to as a parent's Bill of Rights. Parents have plenty of rights already, I assure you. Fortunately, as I say, the transparency provisions didn't pass in this version of 496, but they, as I say, they may reappear again in the future. Another provision that did pass in 496 is the matter of confidentiality. This has to do with the relationship between teacher and student, and the relationship between counselor and student. And what this provision effectively does is takes away the opportunity for students to confide in a teacher or to confide in a school counselor or a school social worker without that information being shared back to their parents. And what I think all of us know is that there are circumstances in kids' lives where sharing that information back with their parents, with information they might share with another significant adult in their life, sharing it back with their parents could put them at risk. And we all know that there are circumstances where kids have been asked to leave their homes as a result of things that they have brought out to their parents or things that their parents have learned about them. So it seems to me that this provision related to confidentiality is a situation that could well put kids at risk in Iowa going forward. But it is indeed part of the law that passed in this state. There's more. This legislature was very busy. So you all, I'm sure, are aware of private school financial aid, which we call the Education Savings Program, and a number of other items here. If there's an asterisk there, it did become law, and you can see quite a few asterisks there. Each of these bills in some way is an affront to teachers, or raises concern about student safety, or may challenge First Amendment rights of free speech. And there are more. I think these bills deny the professionalism and decision-making of educators and convey a lack of confidence that our educators can do their jobs. Recall that if we value the public good to come from public education, we must trust the institution and consider its collective value, not merely its value to me as an individual. And more. As we look at these bills, many from organizations outside Iowa, we should note that nationally, 72% of adults express confidence in their own community's public schools in the most recent Gallup poll. In fact, according to Gallup, parents rate their own children's schools quite highly. More than half give them an A or a B, according to Gallup, yet only 17% of people in that same Gallup survey would say that public schools deserve an equally high grade. So, my school is fine, but public education writ large is not fine, is the message we hear. Now on to school libraries. This did not meet the first funnel deadline, but it certainly caught my attention. This was a provision that would have called for the board of directors of a school district and authorities in charge of an accredited non-public school shall not use any standards or guidance developed by the American Library Association. Whoa. What the American Library Association, some of you may know, publishes a list of award-winning books called the Newbery Award. I bet many of you read Newbery Award-winning books when you were a child. This would say librarians can't go to the Newbery Award-winning list and use that as a justification for buying a book. They also do the Caldecott Award and a number of other award-winning books. They publish book reviews that librarians rely on to make decisions about whether to choose books or not. And they provide overall best practice for librarians. Again, as I say, this did not meet the first funnel deadline, but again, I would say we could see it again someday. I want to make a distinction between libraries and classrooms before we get any further into the conversation about libraries. Libraries and classrooms are a little bit different in terms of their relationship with students, and I have not seen legislatures appreciate this distinction at all. But we have seen Supreme Court cases where texts have been removed from the curriculum but retained in the library, because the library is, in the court's words, a repository for voluntary inquiry. That is different from a classroom where curriculum is required. Similarly, the court has observed, quote, in light of the special role of the school library as a place where students may freely and voluntarily explore diverse topics, the school board's non-curricular decision to remove a book well after it has been placed in the public school libraries evokes the question whether that action might not be an unconstitutional attempt to strangle the free mind at its source. There are a number of other court cases that make that distinction between materials in a library where students are free to choose or not choose, where parents may allow or disallow, in contrast to the classroom. The position of the school librarian is, as this cartoon indicates, is that each parent is responsible for the reading choices of their own child, but not for the children of other parents. This calls for parents to engage with their children at home. I want to just mention a little bit about the selection of library materials, because I think, again, this is a point where not everyone knows exactly what that process is like. But librarians are taught that it is not their role to buy books just because they like them. In fact, oftentimes librarians find themselves selecting books for their collections that they don't particularly like, or wouldn't necessarily be interested in, but that meet criteria that call for them to be in their collection. So they set forth a set of particular criteria that they will follow. You will notice among those criteria, and this is from Mount Vernon, but it's very typical of the policy in school districts across Iowa. Iowa, since 2006, there has been in Iowa Code a mandate that every school district have a policy that says, how do you select materials? So this policy is mandated by the legislature that these criteria be laid out. You'll notice that one of them is appropriate for age, emotional development, ability, learning style, and social development. So it is not as if librarians are not paying attention to what is age appropriate, as we hear in Des Moines. They are paying attention to that. The librarian's role is to offer like what I like to call, and many people do, a marketplace of ideas, and to aim for a collection that offers something for everyone. As I mentioned, since 2006, Iowa Code has required a process for selection and also a process for parents to object, or community members to object to materials. So this is not something new. This legislature may or may not realize that they already have in Iowa Code this provision. It requires that every school district have a way in which parents can request that something be reconsidered. And I would contend that librarians are ready to say they are not perfect. And this process allows an opportunity for a check and balance against the decision-making that librarians engage in. This is a typical process, is that a parent or a citizen can submit a request for reconsideration. That is a request that a school reconsider whether this item belongs in this library, this particular library. The typical form asks for the complainant to indicate whether they've read the entire book, for example, what they're exactly objecting to, and so on. So then a reconsideration committee is convened to consider that challenge, and the typical reconsideration committee is made up of some educators and some parents and or community members. And it used to be students, but this current legislation has decided that students may no longer participate in the reconsideration process. A travesty in my view, because I sat on many reconsideration committees during the time I was in the school board office in Iowa City, and every time it was wonderful to watch those students interact, make decisions, offer their opinions, and understand how democracy works. So it's, I think, very sad that students can now not participate in that process. Ideally, the balance on this committee favors the community. This is intentional because this is an opportunity for the local community to assert its local standards. Professionals are there to offer their expertise as needed, but it is a citizens committee. The decisions of the committee then are passed on to the superintendent and the school board, and typically that's been where it has ended. So, process exists. I will just mention that I mentioned earlier, I sat on many of these reconsideration hearings for books throughout the school district, and I can't tell you how actually rewarding that process was to see people with concerns come forward. Sometimes we ended up deciding in favor of the complainant, and a book was removed or was moved to a different library, or in some way, some way its use was changed. Sometimes we retained the book. In every case, it seems to me, as I recall, the complainant felt good that their complaint had been heard and taken seriously, and everyone left feeling as if a decision had been made with good intention. This is a provision that fortunately did not pass again in 496. again, we could see it come back again, and this was what I called banned in Orange City, banned in Iowa City. At one point, there was a thought in the legislature that that any time a school district decided to remove a book, that book would go on a list at the Department of Education, and that list would be shared with schools throughout Iowa, and that book would be removed from all of the schools if it was removed from one, which would have taken away, had it passed, what I just referred to as the opportunity for the local community to assert its local values. As I say, fortunately, that provision did not pass. But book banning is growing exponentially across the country. Titles that include books with LGBTQ characters or themes, a primary or secondary character of color, books about race and racism, a variety of kinds of bans that include removal of books from school libraries, prohibitions in classrooms, or both. There was a list of books created by the Florida Citizens Alliance. It actually originated from a website called the Christian Patriot Daily, and that list has turned up in many states across the nation. Again, I was thinking this was a local process. It's not sounding very local today. The list from the Florida group in March of 2022 showed up in a Georgia school district where a parent presented a list of 225 books to be challenged. And in that list, 41 of them were from the Florida list. And they knew that because they were not only identical titles, but the same typos appeared in the list that had appeared in the Florida list. So clearly, this has become more than a local issue. In fact, here we see school book bans by state, and you can see the darkest colored states are, of course, the leaders in this endeavor, so to speak. Here we see the subject matter of books that are being banned. And it's interesting to look at this. This is from PEN America, an organization that follows this issue very closely. They have, in fact, recently in the spring, filed a lawsuit against a school district in Florida attesting a violation of First Amendment rights because of their book banning in that school district. So a case to watch, perhaps, going forward. So you can see the kinds of topics that are being focused on across the country. You might look at that number up there, 874 unique titles. So at the same time that we see book banning occurring more and more, in polls, Americans don't think it's such a good idea. So this is a CBS News poll in February of 2022, and you'll see that, basically, people are not enthusiastic about banning books for much of any reason that was asked, at least in that poll. So there is this disconnect between what the majority of Americans seem to believe and what we see happening. Senate File 496 prohibits instruction related to gender identity and sexual orientation in schools, kindergarten through grade 6. Requires that every book available to students be age appropriate and free of any descriptions or visual depictions of a sex act. It requires library programs to contain only age-appropriate materials as defined. And they would say age-appropriate means topics, messages, and teaching methods suitable to particular ages or age groups of children and adolescents based on developing cognitive, emotional, and behavioral capacity typical for the age or age group. I think that's what librarians take into account when they look for age appropriateness. Age appropriate does not include any material with descriptions or visual depictions of a sex act as defined in section 702.17, where that definition is rather explicitly provided. So in Iowa, how have school districts and librarians responded? Well, I think in a good faith effort, we have school districts like Iowa City, Urbandale, and many other districts in Iowa that have looked at the books on their shelves, and they have listed those books that they will remove from their libraries. Basically, oftentimes focusing on removing those that appear to depict sex acts as defined in the Iowa Code. They also are sometimes removing books that are related to sexual harassment, sexual assault, and obscenity. And so we see that happening, that they are preemptively trying to figure out what fits the definitions in the code and take action in advance. There is obviously a reason why school districts are nervous, and that is that there is the threat of loss of licensure hanging over school librarians and teachers if they don't follow the law. The Iowa Library Association early on encouraged librarians to be responsive but not proactive, to wait and let people complain about books and then take action according to their usual process. I think that was popular early on. I think as the deadline approaches, as January approaches and this bill goes into effect, more school districts are becoming more nervous and feeling the need to be more proactive. You know, and many of you probably heard about Mason City, who attempted to use technology to identify what they might be able to justify keeping and not keeping. Among the books that were identified in their use of technology was Friday Night Lights, which I had trouble understanding. Anyway, the bottom line is schools are trying to figure it out. You know, and the consequences are severe. And so there's a lot of anxiety in schools about what is okay to do. Meanwhile, the Department of Education is scheduled to provide some guidance by December 31st. So we will see what guidance comes in December. In review, we have already got policies and procedures to ensure that school librarians select resources professionally. We have a system to question their decisions if necessary. Here's a problem that I have, and that is that many of these bills are not written by our state legislators. USA Today analyzed legislation from 2010 to 2018 and found some 10,000 bills introduced into state legislatures that had been copied from model legislation. The most famous bill generator, of course, is ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. But there are many other more narrowly focused groups, like No Left Turn in Education generates model legislation that would look very familiar if you were looking at Iowa Code and what they are promoting. They particularly aim against teaching racial issues. So does the Manhattan Institute. You know, on the liberal side, the ACLU generates model legislation. And so does, in fact, the League of American Bicyclists and many other special interest groups. I find this whole process of nationalized, federalized model legislation damaging to our living democratically. I, Pollyanna that I am, would like to see local legislation be local. Unfortunately, that is not the world we live in. This is a list of other organizations that education, particularly affecting education, has come from. There are many, many more. The spread of concern about LGBTQ issues, racial issues, ethnicity issues, may provide evidence of the power of the national media, including social media, the power of disinformation campaigns and agendas related to school privatization, and unfortunately, the discrediting of public education and the notion of public education as a public good. Not only are legislatures overwhelmed by national agendas, so are school boards. There are political organizations that are working to train school board members in topics of interest to them. It is no coincidence that the same issues arise in school boards across the country, just as they do in legislatures. You can see here some examples of organizations that offer training for school board candidates and for school board members after they are elected. All of these are designed to help them understand how best to advance specific agendas. This is a list of events, and I think we want to ask ourselves, what effect have these events had on people's trust? Because it seems to me that we have been bombarded by all of these things that have created an atmosphere of questioning institutions that are founded on the notion of the public good. And that is public schools. It is also government, local, state, federal. A number of institutions have lost our trust, and I think we've been impacted by all of these events of recent times in that endeavor. So the consequences of all this are frightening to me. 55% of teachers polled by the National Education Association last year said that they would leave teaching sooner than they had originally planned. While there are various reasons for teachers to exit the schoolhouse, political controversies and lack of community support are high among their reasons. Teacher education enrollment nationally is down since 2010, according to the Center for American Progress. Most parents surveyed by Phi Delta Kappa International in 2018 indicated they do not want their children to become teachers. Current and former teachers don't want their children to become teachers. That's where we used to get our teachers, kids whose parents were teachers. The MetLife survey of the American teachers showed the percent of teachers that were very satisfied with their career reached a high of 62% in 2008. In 2008, 62% of teachers were very satisfied with their profession. Satisfaction has fallen, and in 2022, in that same survey, it is at 12%. 12% of teachers find their careers satisfying today. An Education Advisory Board survey found that 50% of superintendents plan to leave their jobs in the next 2 to 3 years. The National Association of Secondary School Principals found that only 29% of secondary school principals plan to continue in their profession to retirement. This is a tremendous loss of expertise. And in my view, when we lose expertise, we lose those people who will mentor the next generation of teachers, and we lose all the accumulated wisdom of that generation of teachers. And this can have severely damaging effects, in my view, on education for the next generation of kids coming forward. I worry a lot. I worry that the current environment will cause master teachers to walk away from the profession. I worry that the current environment will affect licensure. We've had high standards for teachers in Iowa, and with too many teachers leaving the profession and fewer people choosing this career, I fear the reduction in standards for licensure will happen simply to fill the jobs. I worry that the current environment will erode public schools and move us toward more private schools and homeschooling, but public schools were founded on the principle of the public good. I worry that the curriculum in our schools will be narrowed and will leave out important, even if controversial, topics that students should be analyzing and discussing and debating. And I wish I could leave you with an answer to the question of restoring the notion of public education in the public good. Perhaps each of us needs to think, what can I do to bring some of this best relationship between the public and public schools back? And these are the best things I could come up with. Vote for school board candidates who support teachers. Encourage communication between parents and teachers and the school. Write to legislators in support of teachers and students. Pay attention to proposed legislation and express your views on it. Express support for teachers and librarians with administrators and school boards locally. Thank teachers and librarians publicly and in person. Just briefly, what's happening around us? Here are some things that are going on in other states. In West Virginia and Kentucky, they are raising teacher salaries. In South Carolina and Virginia, they are raising starting salaries and offering retention bonuses for teachers. In Wisconsin, they are working at grow your own programs to recruit teachers. In Kentucky, Illinois, and Michigan, among other states, they are working toward or have put in place universal pre-K education. In Illinois, they have increased pay for preschool teachers and child care workers. And in Illinois and California, they have banned book banning. Yay for them. Bottom line, our democracy depends on the effective education of today's students for a complex society of the future. Also, if this is a topic that's of interest to you, I'm just going to suggest a few books. The first of those is The Teacher Wars. The next is The Death of Expertise. And the third one is a book called The Teachers, A Year Inside America's Most Vulnerable and Important Profession. And each of these takes this issue on in a different way, but each of them is very good at helping us get a sense of what's going on and perhaps what we can do about it. Thank you. I think we have a couple of minutes. If there's a comment from anyone or a question, Barb has a microphone.
We have time for a few questions. Hi, Maggie.
Hi. What about debate teams? Are debate teams still allowed?
Well, as far as I know, the question was, are debate teams still alive? Or alive? Are they still allowed? And as far as I know, there's nothing that's taken away debate teams. It will be interesting to see what topics they're allowed to debate in this state, for example, because they probably can't debate any of those divisive concepts. So it kind of comes down to what?
It's unclear how some of this applies to organizations and clubs. Like, that's really unclear.
As are many things.
Yes.
Yes, Byron.
Wait for me, wait for me.
Are satisfied with their job. How do you propose going about recruiting young students to go into this profession?
Well, I think recruiting young people to go into this profession is really a challenge right now. And I would say that that's a societal problem for all of us, is to help ameliorate this relationship that we have with public schools and public school teachers. I think that the fact that schools, that local schools are well liked by their local communities provides some hope that we can, in our own communities, recruit students within our own space. But we will have to work at it, and we will have to help them see that it's a profession worthy of their time. I know that Susan would like to make a comment from the league, so
Okay,
I'll let you
just a minute,
take
wait for me.
take the stage.
Stand by the microphone here.
Yeah, you can hear your voice on there.
Hi, I'm with the League of Women Voters, and I want to thank the library and Trails for co-sponsoring, and actually Trails initiated Jean's talk today. I've learned a lot. I also want to remind people that we have another talk on public education, following public education for the public good, and this talk will be on January 25th here in the library at 6:30 p.m. Superintendent of Schools Matt Degner will be addressing House File 68, Challenges and Changes for Public Schools. And I think that will be a lecture worth attending. I also want to thank Jean very much on behalf of the League for presenting today, giving you one of our mugs.
Thank you. That is lovely. Thank you so much,
welcome.
Susan.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for inviting me.
And thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it.